myself have been involved in commercial real estate for as long as I can remember. And actually, before this, I was helping and assisting with the small business development. I've been a consultant and helping with small business management, dealing with growth, scaling, and finances. So myself, well suited to speak on each of your cases and very familiar with the real estate component in Florida. Now, to start off tonight, I want to start with three very important numbers. Those numbers are 85, 54, and 80. 85. 85% of dentists have a lease agreement that can prevent them from ever selling their practice. And for many of those that are on this evening's webinar as well, that is definitely the case for you. Now, over the course of the pandemic and some of the implications that the landlords have put into place, this number has actually risen due to some of the landlord constraints. 54%. 54% of dentists across North America are overpaying in rent for their practice. Now, given some of the market fluctuations as well over the pandemic, this number has also seen an increase. So very important that we note that we are most likely overpaying in our rental rates. Of course, 80%. 80% of landlords structure the lease agreement to give themselves a right to at least 50% of the proceeds when the practice is sold, meaning that 80% of you on this webinar this evening might have a lease agreement that actually allows the landlord to take some of the practice acquisition price as their own. Now, just to give you a little bit of background about us, who we are, what we do, we are a healthcare and dental specialized tenant representation firm, really the only one of our kind. And we were founded by dentists for dentists about 26 years ago. Now, we found that, unfortunately, many of yourselves and your colleagues were being taken advantage of by landlords and brokers. Though you were so eager to start the practice and get going, that unfortunately you were pressured into the sale, into the deal, without really knowing what was in your lease agreement and overpaying in your rental rates. Now, for this reason, because we were noticing this, we were founded. Now, to this day, 26 years later, we have negotiated over 12,000 dental office lease agreements. Now, when I said that we were unique, what I mean by that is that we have everything in-house. We have our own in-house legal and leasing team, those of which that comprise every day of negotiating the lease with landlords, some of which who have been with us for over 18 years, and those that actually used to work on the landlord side, negotiating against dentists. We took them over from the dark side, if you will, to help dentists negotiate against landlords, really giving us some of that inside information. Our leasing team, they're comprised of individuals that look through the markets, look at market rates, identify, are we overpaying in rent, underpaying in rent? If so, by how much? And then our consulting team, which I'm part of. As mentioned, I'm one of our senior consultants here. And we really focus on educating yourselves and your colleagues on the dental office lease agreement, what pitfalls may be within, and some strategies for negotiating your lease agreement. Now, annually, we represent over 500 doctors throughout America per year, and we deliver over 100 continuing education accredited seminars annually. Now, prior to the pandemic, I myself was traveling all throughout the United States, putting on in-person seminars and visiting offices, doing in-person lease analysis. Now, unfortunately, we've had to move to the webinar platform, but many of our courses were in person. Now, in addition to that, we also lecture at most of the major dental conventions, such as the Greater New York, the Pacific Dental Conference, the Yankee Dental Conference, and the California Dental Association, just to name a few, but there's definitely many, many more that we attend as well. Now, what's the purpose of today's webinar? We want to take a look at the current landlord and tenant relationship, really dive into how that's changed over the course of the pandemic and what that brings to the table for yourselves. Then, of course, we want to dive into the importance of the office lease agreement. Really, what makes it different than any other lease agreement? We want to touch on the landlord negotiation strategies, really diving into the key terms and conditions that are within your dental office lease agreement, and some practical advice on what those mean, how to combat them, etc. Now, before we get into all that, I want to take a quick look at the market trends in some of the cities across Florida. So first we have Orlando here. Now the blue line is indicating the rental rates and the orange line identifying the vacancy rates. Now, as we can see here, we're in for a dip, not a major dip as many expected over the course of the pandemic. Many expected there to be a large drop in rental rates. Now we are seeing a minor one, but for any of those on today's call that are overpaying in their rent, this is a great opportunity to reset some of those financials. So you can see here, we're seeing that the vacancy rate is due for an increase, as well as the rental rates to drop in Orlando. Now, very similar situation in West Palm Beach. We see here that, once again, there is set to be a decrease in rent and an increase in vacancies, but not as much as everyone thought. Now, what is a lease? This is one of my favorite questions that I ask when I'm running my in-person seminars, and obviously, fortunately, it's a one-way dialogue this evening. However, if anybody does have any questions, we do have a Q&A section that we will be answering this evening, so feel free to comment in there as well. But what is a lease? Now, the most common answer is a legally binding contract with terms and conditions, which is absolutely the case. However, what I want everybody on this evening's webinar to think of it as this, as a check, the most expensive check that you'll ever sign. Now, once again, when asking this question, I ask another follow-up, which is, what is the most expensive investment you'll ever make in your life? Now, the most common response that I receive is a house. Now, for anybody that is not a dentist, that is absolutely the case. Unfortunately, as a dentist, the largest expense you will ever make in your professional career is the lease agreement in that space. Now, when you're signing a check, I'm sure all of you, if you were signing a check for $1 million, you would all want to know what the terms and conditions, what strings are attached with that, what else comes along there. Now, unfortunately, many of you on this evening's webinar, when you signed this lease agreement initially, you thought of the dollar amount and not much of the additional terms and conditions below that. So that's why today we're going to dive in on why those 50 plus pages below the initial page of the lease or below that check are so important. So why is the office lease so important, especially during COVID-19? Now, as many of you know, the office is the foundation of your practice. Where many other tenants are learning that they do not need to be in their space, many businesses, many tenants are sitting there and realizing they don't need their space to operate their daily functions, operate their daily business. Whereas for yourselves as dentists, that is absolutely not the case. Without your dental practice, there in the actual physical location, there is no practice. Now, unfortunately, a very common trend that I've heard over the past 8 months is for any of those periods of time where you were shut down due to government regulations, many did not pay rent. If you are one of these individuals that did not pay rent, the repercussions of that can be catastrophic. You may be in default of your lease agreement today. So for any of you that did not pay your rent and did not receive some form of agreement from the landlord if you were not paying your rent, this could be greatly impacting your future leverage. And some of you, your renewal options may actually be null and void for not paying your rent over the course of the pandemic. Now, the investment and the cost to build a dental practice, as I mentioned earlier, this is the most expensive business in commercial real estate and the largest initial investment coming into the space. Now, for that reason, we want to ensure that you are protecting your investment in the space. Without that, as mentioned earlier, you lose your practice, you lose your business in the location. So highly important that we recognize that due to the sheer amount of money that we've invested into the space, we need to ensure that our lease agreement is working to protect that on our behalf. We want to make the lease agreement into a strong foundation where we build our business upon rather than a crumbling shell as it may be today. Now, it's very difficult, very expensive, and of course time consuming to move your dental practice. Once you have made that investment and have committed to that next step, the money you have invested into this space is there and there for good. Now, if you were to decide, maybe you're driving into work one day and you think, maybe I don't want to be here anymore. You want to relocate a mile down the road. How hard is it to move your practice? It's very, very difficult. And on average, most dentists spend over 28 years within the same location. On some cases, if you're in a family business and continually being handed down, sometimes that's upwards of 40, 45 years. So we know that we're here, we're in this space, and we've made this investment. Once again, we want to make sure that our lease is protecting us here because it's not easy just to pick up and move. Now, a key component is the actual sale of your practice. Many of you may not realize, but without your lease, the actual sale of the practice is greatly diminished. And as I mentioned earlier on today's webinar, some of you may have leases in place that actually block the sale of your practice. So if the lease is not properly structured, all this work and all this investment that we've put into this space over the past years could be blocked by the lease agreement and by your landlord for those retirement funds that you are looking forward to when you hang it all up. And of course, the lease gives you leverage. What I mean by that is that with the ongoing pandemic and given that many tenants are leaving the spaces and landlords, for lack of a better term, are bleeding and their vacancy rates are increasing, You, as a tenant with a lease in place, a long-term lease in place, gives you a significant amount of leverage because you're allowing the landlord to recognize this revenue. So highly important that many of you realize that the actual amount of leverage that you have just for your lease agreement. Because think about this, many of you have made that investment into the space. We're not going anywhere. And we're a good tenant. Over the course of the pandemic, where many have left, we've stayed. We've continued to pay our rents, make our obligations. We are the ideal tenant. The average default rate of a dentist is less than 1%. So landlords know that, and they know that they need to keep you. So never forget the leverage that you have as a dental tenant. Now, what should the dental office lease do for you? First and foremost, it should provide fair and affordable financial terms. Now, what do I mean by that? We need to take a look at our internal versus our external fees. Internal being, what do you produce? And what is your overhead? What are your collections? What do you have to pay your staff each month? And then take that versus what are the asking rates? What are comparable spaces in and around my area going for? What are they asking for rents? And then you take those two factors and really drill down to see if you can afford that. An additional financial aspect to consider is common area maintenance fees. Many of you today are overpaying in your common area maintenance fees, whereas the landlord is actually passing along costs to you as the tenant that they should not be. Now, for this reason, there's many protections to put in place here, such as audit rights for yourself, allowing you to actually fact check the landlord and ensure that whatever they're charging you for is fair and true. Really, we want to ensure through the lease agreement that we have the ability to fact check the landlord, but also want to make sure that they're not passing on costs that they should not be doing. Now, for any of you on today's webinar that actually built out your space or built it from scratch, if you took any tenant improvement allowances from the landlord, that was not free rent, and that is baked back into the rental rate, causing your rates to inflate year over year over year and an option period over option period. So when evaluating these financials, we need to take a look. Is this high rental rate due to tenant improvement? What else can this be due to, and what can be impacting this? Additionally, the office lease should provide you with long-term stability and security. So going back to the point I made earlier regarding your long haul within the space, more often than not, we want to ensure a 10-year term with 2 5-year options, essentially giving us 20 years of runway and foreseeability within the space. And as mentioned, this gives you significant leverage, giving the landlord the ability to recognize 20 years worth of revenue from today. And especially over the course of the pandemic, many landlords, when we've positioned a long-term renewal to them, they're jumping through hoops to ensure that they retain you as a tenant and can do whatever they can to keep you. Now, additionally, with the long-term stability and security, it puts you in a better position to sell your practice. Now, many of the major financial institutions, whether it be Bank of America, Wells Fargo, etc., they need at least 10 years of term on the lease agreement in order to finance the acquisition. So with a long-term lease, the more term and options you have on that lease agreement, the easier it is to sell the practice. Now, of course, the lease should also minimize your risk and exposure. Now, many of you on today's webinar may have signed your lease personally, meaning that where it says tenant on the lease agreement, it says Joe Smith DDS. This puts you in great exposure for the landlord, because what this means is that if there's ever any discrepancy, any default, any issues with the landlord now has the right to come after you personally, meaning the house, the car, the estate, etc. So we want to ensure that through the lease agreement, we've properly structured it so that it reduces as much risk and exposure as possible. We also, on the other hand, we also wanted to maximize your flexibility. Now, if you're in your building and you're starting to see a business ramp up and you need more space, we want to ensure that we have the proper language in place that gives us the ability to expand next door if there's a vacancy. We want to ensure that maybe if it's in your career trajectory to own the building, that we've set up the lease so that it gives you that right. So that really whatever path you want to go down moving forward, we've now given yourself that ability in and through the lease in legally binding language. Now, an additional component is if anything is to happen to you, whether that's a physical injury or any form of mental incapacitation to the point where you're no longer able to practice dentistry, we still want to ensure that we're covered and we're protected through our lease in that event as well. Right? Really, we want to ensure that we've wrapped the lease around our lives instead of wrapping our lives around the lease. Make that lease work for you and not the other way around. And of course, very key component is ensure that the lease actually enhances your ability to eventually sell your practice. As mentioned, many of you may have a lease in place that will prohibit or greatly restrict your ability to sell the practice. We want to ensure that we have the proper language in place that allows us to sell and make that process as easy and smooth of a transition as possible. Now, here are some components to look out for within the lease agreement. So first we have the assignment clause. Now this clause here really dictates how you can sell the practice, to whom you can sell the practice to, and what the landlord's involvement in that process looks like. How many rights do you have as the tenant? This is really the clause that I'm mentioning when I'm talking about your ability to sell and ensure that it's structured properly so that you can sell. Next, there's the demolition clause. Now, an increasingly popular trend within lease agreements is the demolition clause, whereas this gives the landlord the right through the lease, if they so desire, to redevelop the plaza, they redevelop the building, or they've sold the property for other purposes, it gives them the right to terminate your lease agreement and sell or redevelop, generally speaking with very limited notice as well. So we want to make sure that we have our lease structured so that we don't get blindsided by the landlord's desire for the location and for the building. Next, we have a relocation clause, which is the landlord's ability to relocate you anywhere within the building or their own properties, depending on the size of your landlord, some of which on here this evening have landlords of large sizes where they have multiple properties within the city. If that is the case, some of those landlords have actually built the right into their lease to relocate you to a completely different property, meaning that you may be in southeastern Tampa, but they own a property in St. Petersburg, and they're now going to relocate you up there. So very, very crucial that these are structured properly. We have the proper protections in place in this case. Ideally, of course, having some of these removed from the lease. The death and disability clause, as I just mentioned, ensuring that you're protected in any event. The personal guarantees, once again, going to that personal liability and that exposure. Many of you today, if you have not signed personally on the lease agreement, may have been required to sign a personal guarantee as well when you signed on as your corporation. Now, the financial statements aspect that you can see on the second column at the bottom, this has been an increasingly interesting area of the lease agreement. Whereas if you had applied over the pandemic for some landlord assistance, whether that be rent abatement, rent deferral, free rent, anything of that nature, if the landlord has requested your financial statements at that point in time and you declined, you may in fact be in default of your lease agreement, depending on the financial statements section of the lease. So we want to make sure that if we did request any assistance, and if the landlord requests our financial statements and we did not provide them, we want to make sure that we're not in default, because this could mean a number of things, whether it be increases in rent, loss of space, various defaults. Very important and very prevalent topic over the past 6 to 8 months. Now, first, I want to discuss this option to renew clause. And as it states there, this is found within 90% of leases. I'm just going to give everyone a couple seconds here to read through it and maybe identify what may be incorrect here, and then I will go through it myself. Excellent. Okay. So as it states right within the first line, provided that Dr. Joe Black shall remain as the tenant. That's our first red flag. Now, the reason that some of you may have identified or may be asking why that's an issue is this. If I am Dr. Joe Black and I sell it to Dr. Jim Smith, I am no longer that tenant, which means that my options to renew the lease are now null and void. Meaning, and as we discussed earlier, with those 10 years of term required by the financial institution, without the option to renew, it can become very difficult to sell. If I'm in the 7th year of a 10-year lease with 2 remaining 5-year options, and I sell the practice, the incoming buyer only has the rights to 3 of those remaining 13 years. So we really want to make sure that the options to renew are not personal to ourselves. Now, going further to that, it says, shall remain as the tenant, and if the tenant duly and has regularly paid its rent and has performed its covenants and obligations under this lease and has not been in default. So going back to the comment, for any of you that may not have paid your rent over the course of the pandemic, if you did not receive any form of agreement from the landlord for doing so, you may be in default of your lease agreement and your options to renew may be null and void. Now, moving forward, it states that any such renewal shall be on the landlord's then current standard form lease. Now, the issue with this is if we've worked very hard to secure a proper lease agreement, we've gone through the negotiations, or we're overall happy with our lease, once you renew that lease agreement, the landlord has the ability to present you with a completely new one. Now, why might that be a problem? Is maybe there's clauses that are being added, and more often than not, that's the case, whether that be the relocation clause, the demolition clause, or many of the other aspects. We want to ensure that we're operating while in the space on the same lease, and that we're not going to have any uncertainties being thrown into the lease agreement that we might not be aware of. But now, on this new standard form lease agreement, at a minimum rent to be determined between landlord and tenant, but in no event shall it be less than the rent paid in the last year of the original term. Meaning that you are on the world's most boring roller coaster. Your rent is only going up, 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 and up, and never coming back down. And now, unfortunately, this is a very common piece of the lease agreement, that your rent is always to be greater and never less, regardless of any market fluctuations. Actually, a few years ago, we actually represented the dentist of the Miami Heat, and he had very similar language as this within his lease agreement. Now, unfortunately, he bought into at the height of the market. And now when it crashed back in 2008, 2009, he was stuck paying significantly higher rents than those of tenants that were coming into the space at that time. So we want to ensure that we're not stuck forever increasing, and that we have abilities to move with the ebbs and flows of the market. Now, at the bottom there, you can see the final highlight where it's discussing that if the landlord and tenant are unable to agree on market rent within 60 days of the exercise by tenant of its option to renew, then the rent shall be determined by arbitration based on the market rent for renewing tenants in the building. Now, the difficulty here is that with renewing tenants within the building, there can be a variety of different aspects that are reflected in their rental rates for different reasons, whether it's based on the tenant improvement allowance, the common area maintenance fees, they've had landlord work done. We want to ensure that what they're actually evaluating for that market rent is fair and not misconstrued to our situation. Now we have the assignment agreement. So once again, as mentioned, this is the portion of the lease agreement that really dictates how you can sell the practice, to whom you can sell the practice to, and what the landlord's involvement in that sale looks like. So once again, I'm just going to give everyone a moment here to read through this clause, and then I'll go through it again as well. All right, so first and foremost, it states that if the tenant should wish to assign or sublet the leased premises, it shall first have received the consent of the landlord. So essentially what this is stating is that if you want to sell your practice, you must first receive the landlord's prior written consent. The landlord must say yes for you to sell. Now, this is a very common aspect of the lease agreement. Right? Now, I'm sure if any of you are the landlord, you would want some say in who can stay within the space, who can leave, and what obligations are to be in place at that point in time. Now, however, where this becomes an issue is on the next highlighted portion, where it states that the landlord shall have the option to 1. Approve tenant's request to assign the lease, 2. Decline tenant's request to assign the lease, or 3. Terminate the lease agreement upon the effective date of such proposed lease assignment or sublet. So what it's stating here is that just for asking the landlord to sell your practice and to sign the lease agreement, the landlord has the right to terminate your lease, essentially ripping the rug out from underneath you at time of sale. Now, many of you may be wondering, why would the landlord do that? What does the landlord have, and what rationale is behind doing so? Well, it's quite simple. It's that you have now done the landlord's work for them. You have found an interested party that is interested in the space, and the landlord knows that there's a large amount of money to be changing hands here. Now, if they terminate your lease, they've greatly reduced the acquisition price for the incoming doctor, and now the landlord is able to market a fully built out dental practice to an already interested party, usually meaning that they increase rents by a certain percentage, cut yourselves out of the sale, and have the new buyer and tenant pay that increased rent for that pre-built out practice. Now, should the landlord consent to an assignment or sublet of the premises, landlord shall have the right to revise the minimum rent to be paid during the remainder of the term to the greater of the then fair market rent for the leased premises, or 15% greater than the current rent. So meaning you've gone through the steps, the landlord has decided they're going to let you sell the practice, you've received their approval, but now they say, well, hold on, with that, we're also going to increase your rent by 15%. What effect do you think that would have on the buyer? You've already agreed to everything, but at the last minute, they've now seen that they're going to be facing a large rental rate increase. 99% of the time, when this occurs, the buyer gets cold feet and walks away from the deal. And far too often have I seen landlord involvement in the 11th hour of the sale process destroy the actual deal. You want to make sure that the landlord's involvement in that is as limited as possible. Now, should the tenant receive from the assignee or tenant any rental income, cash goods, or any form of consideration in connection with the assignment of this lease or the sublet of the premises that is over and above the current base rental rates payable to landlord in any fiscal year during the term of this lease, the difference between annual rental rate and such rental income, cash, goods, or other consideration shall be paid to the landlord within 30 days of tenant's receipt thereof. Now, to cut through the legal jargon of that, essentially what it's stating is that, let's say I sell my practice for $1 million and my annual rental rate is $100,000 a year. The landlord has the right to request that $900,000, the difference between the sale price and the annual rent. Landlord has the right to request that $900,000 and take that away from you. Now, we want to ensure that this is not the case. The landlord argues that your practice value is predicated on the location. Now, this is an okay clause for a local restaurant or a law office, something of that nature. This is not the case for a high-class tenant or a dental practice. This is not acceptable. All that hard-earned money and that the blood, sweat, and tears that go into your dental practice should not be taken away by the landlord. Now, the final sentence here is that notwithstanding the landlord's consent to any assignment or subletting, the tenant shall not be released from its obligation under the lease and shall remain liable for any failure of the tenant or its assignees or subtenants to observe each and every obligation. So what it's stating here is that The landlord has accepted that you're going to assign the lease and sell the practice. They've now taken your sale proceeds for the sale of your practice, and to top it all off, now they're going to keep you continually liable on the lease agreement, so that if there is any form of default from the buyer, the landlord has the right to come after yourself. Now, unfortunately, a couple years ago, we actually had a doctor from Michigan. He moved down to Florida, and after 3.5 years of selling the practice, he got a phone call from his landlord, where the landlord said, "Hi, doctor. Hope all is well and you're enjoying retirement. I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but unfortunately, the buyer of your practice has now gone in default of the past 4 months of rent and has declared bankruptcy. So what we need from you is for you to come back up here, pay the 4 months of defaulted upon rent and the remainder of the term until you find another buyer." This ended up costing the doctor over $80,000 out of pocket of his retirement income. One way to think of this is like co-signing for your neighbor's kid's car and saying good luck, have fun, and keeping your fingers crossed, hoping nothing happens. And like it says at the top, this is found in 75% of dental office leases. I would actually argue that maybe even more. So now we want to get into the practical aspect of this. Now, in terms of the lease negotiation, timing is everything. We as a firm always advise to begin the renewal process about 30 to 24 months prior to the expiration of the lease agreement. Now, the reason that we advise this is simple. It's purely from a leverage standpoint. As we discussed earlier, it takes a great deal of time and money to relocate the practice. And don't be fooled, the landlord is keenly aware of this aspect as well. That's why many of your option to renew deadlines or your option to renew periods are anywhere between 3 and 6 months out from the expiration of the lease. The landlord knows that at that 6 to 3 month period, it is nearly far too late for you to pick up and relocate the practice without you facing some downtime, some loss, or some patient attrition. So by starting at the 24-month time period, we give ourselves ample amount of time if that is the case, because on average it takes anywhere between 12 and 18 months to relocate that dental practice. By starting at 30 to 24, little alarm bells go off in the landlord's mind. They go, "Why is Dr. Smith looking to renew their lease so early? What's going on behind the scenes?" That allows us to hold that relocation card close to the chest and have the ability, or threaten the ability, to play it. Though that's never the objective going through the negotiation, it's a nice to have, and it gives you that extended leverage when going through the negotiations to the landlord. Now, I want to talk about some of the changes in opportunity that we have seen over the past 8 to 6 months and due to the COVID-19 pandemic. First, I want to talk about renewing your lease. So first and foremost, long-term lease renewals. Once again, going back to that, the more time that you are willing to put on the lease, the longer term gives you increased leverage. Going back to the fact that while many landlords are bleeding and losing tenants, if you are coming forward and saying, "Dear Mr. Landlord, I would really like to extend my lease for 20 years, this gives you an unbelievable amount of leverage, and landlords really are jumping through hoops to try and secure their long-term tenants. And of course, resetting financials. As I mentioned when going through some of the market trends, this is a great opportunity to reset some of those inflated financials you may have today, giving them that long-term lease, showing them market trends, and bringing those financials back down to market where you're paying above. Now, for some of you on today's webinar that I know in the poll in question mentioned you were looking to start up your first practice, first and foremost, the equipment and supplies side of the industry is putting on amazing incentives. They know that these are difficult times, and they're helping provide these equipment and supplies at cheaper rates, longer terms, really doing their best to assist with the new start and the build out. And of course, landlords are desperate to fill vacancies. So once again, coming with that long-term lease, filling the void that the landlord has been seeing sit there for the past months and not being able to collect any revenue off that, coming forward as a completely new tenant and saying, "Dear Mr. Landlord, I would love to fill that space for the next 20 years. Unbelievable amount of incentivization from landlords. Now here's just a quick graphic of how we assist with knowing those financials in each market. We're tracking over 95 billion square feet, over 4.6 million properties, and over 1.5 million verified listings. So we really do have the ability through our proprietary data and our software to get a clear understanding of each market, what's happening, what's transpiring, what are the changes, what are the fluctuations, how much are we paying, overpaying, underpaying, etc. We really get to see the clear facts. And when going forth in the negotiations with the landlord, having these facts to display to them and saying, this is our market rate, this is what is going on directly around us, really carries an unbelievable amount of weight through the negotiations and gives you true facts to negotiate upon rather than a hunch or a guess. Now, why have we been so successful here at Cirrus? How have we successfully negotiated over 12,000 dental office lease agreements? Now, it really boils down to these 8 steps. Now, step 1 is that we gather all of the information. So all documentation, all lease documents, any pertaining amendments, riders, etc. We want to gather every piece of documentation possible so that we have all the clear facts in front of us. Next, we want to identify your practice and career goals. How long do you want to continue to practice? What do you want the practice to look like? Do you want to bring on any associates, specialists? We really dig in to what you see happening over the next 10, 15, 20 years and get a clear understanding of what your core objectives are for your own career and for your practice. Next, we read the lease cover to cover. We want to know exactly what's in the lease agreement. Every page, every line, every clause. We want to ensure that we have all of the facts in front of us and have done a clear and accurate review of that lease agreement so we know exactly what we're dealing with. Now next, we prepare with market research. So like I showed on the graphic in the previous slide, we collect all of that data about what's going on in the market, what do we see happening, what are the trends, what are the vacancies, etc. So then we move on to step 5. Now this is what we call the strategy call, where you sit down with the lease negotiator and you outline what are your high, medium, and low priority items. What do you want to achieve through this negotiation? Right? Some of the high priority items, meaning these are our must-haves in order to classify this as a successful negotiation. Some of the medium priority items that would be nice to haves, and some of the low priority items, meaning what are we willing to concede upon in order to get some of those medium and high priority items. Now, as you can see here, we've gone through 5 steps of our process, and we still have not done one thing, and that's reach out to the landlord. We want to ensure that through step 1 through 5, we have a clear trajectory and understanding on what we want to unfold over the course of this negotiations. Now, step 6, we deal with the economic portion of the lease negotiation, meaning we get the best financial deal possible before we even touch the legal components, ensuring that those common area maintenance fees are correct, ensuring that we're paying a fair rent in regards to the market, getting those market rates and your rental rates back to alignment. Now, after we've secured the best financial deal with the landlord, we then move on to step 7, which is negotiating all of the legal components of the lease agreement. All those red flags that the lease negotiator has identified that, and those liabilities that you've exposed yourself to through the lease agreement, we want to negotiate those out. Now, once step 7 is completed, most usually think, okay, well, the negotiation's over. But we have step 8, which is nearly as important as all of the rest, which is the final review. Now, unfortunately, what does occur very often is that we've gone through the full negotiation of the lease, and prior to its execution, the landlord tries to slide in a new clause. They try to take out some of the language that we've already put in place. So we go through a full review, and we have software specifically designed to track any minor changes or large changes within the lease agreement and ensure that nothing has changed and there's been no funny business upon the landlord's final review and sending it back to us. And then once we've double checked, triple checked that the lease is still the way we have negotiated to be, we then execute the lease agreement, and then you start your tenancy. So beyond actually negotiating leases for dentists, yourselves and your colleagues, we also offer the critical dates and risk analysis. Now, this is a $1,500 service where we spend 3 to 4 hours analyzing your lease agreement for traps. We then get on a scheduled call to go over your vision and your plan, the traps that we uncovered through the lease agreement and what they mean to you, what impacts those have on you, and then what the ideal lease should look like specific to your situation, and how to negotiate effectively a tactical plan. Now, as a thank you to everybody in attendance this evening, the critical dates and risk analysis that's typically valued at $1,500 will be on a complimentary basis. Once again, as a thank you for everybody attending this evening. If you are interested, there's going to be another poll that will pop up here momentarily. You can fill that out, provide your details, or if you have any questions or specific concerns, please feel free to give my number a call. It's right there on screen, or send me an email. Happy to help where I can, and feel free to reach out. I look forward to speaking with each and every one of you and assisting with the lease. So I've got a couple questions here. See, I am less than the 24-month period. Does that mean that I've lost all my leverage to negotiate the lease. Not at all. Just because we're beneath that 24-month period does not mean we've lost leverage, but we need to act relatively quickly and get a good understanding on the situation and what has gone on thus far, what the landlord looks like, what the vacancies are. I'd be happy to speak with you after today's course and go through that. Happy to help. Another one here. I did not pay my rent over the course of my shutdown. I did not receive anything from my landlord. Okay, doctor, we should connect on that. If you did receive any documentation, any verbal commitments from your landlord, necessary to know, let's set up a call. Feel free to shoot me an email, or I can shoot you an email as well. It's definitely a big one to talk about. And once again, I want to thank everyone for taking time out of their evening today to attend today's webinar. Leave the exit questionnaire up for just a few more moments. And thanks again for everyone, and I look forward to speaking with you all soon.